And you agree that 799 pounds of carbon per megawatt hour is more than what the ISO reports as the weighted average for all New England generators of 710 pounds per megawatt hour?
Yes, the 799 would be higher than the average of 710 for New England. That's correct.
In fact, more than 12% higher, is that right?
Your math sounds correct, yes.
So this plant would emit 89 pounds more carbon per megawatt hour than the weighted average of all New England plants as reported by the ISO.
Again, and I think this is where we started, it's higher than the average in this case, using the 799. That number is higher than where I had the plant operating. And I think you need to look at it in terms of carbon displaced in the system, which is going to be a much higher number than the average.
Mr. Hardy, would you agree with me that New England has seen increased deployment of renewable energy resources over the past decade?
Yes.
Would you agree with me that sitting here today, you expect additional deployment of renewable energy resources in New England in the coming decade?
Yes.
In the coming 2 decades?
Yes.
You're aware of the fact that Rhode Island's carbon emission reduction goal, as set forth in the Resilient Rhode Island Act, is a reduction of 80% over 1990 levels by 2050. Is that correct?
That sounds correct, yes.
And you discussed the Resilient Rhode Island Act in some length in your testimony.
I do.
What is your expert opinion of the impact that this power plant would have if it were built in the year 2050 on the ability of Rhode Island to reduce its carbon emissions by 80% over 1990 levels?
Well, to be clear, my forecast did not go out to 2050. What I can tell you is based on the forecast that is contained in my analysis, the addition of Clear River to the electricity market will result in a reduction of carbon emissions. So I believe that this plant will help Rhode Island and really help New England achieve carbon reduction goals.
And to be clear, your analysis only went out 4 years, is that right?
That's correct. Although I would expect the carbon reduction to continue on past that. I just didn't run it out to 2050.
Right, and you said in your pre-filed testimony that you had done the analysis for 4 years, is that right?
That's correct.
And you said that although you didn't do the analysis, you would expect carbon emissions to run longer than those 4 years.
Reduction in carbon emissions,
Right.
yes.
Yes. My question now is, what is your expert opinion of the impact that this power plant would have if it were built in the year 2050 on the ability of Rhode Island to reduce its carbon emissions by 80% below 1990 levels?
I couldn't specifically comment on the year 2050 without running the analysis, but based on the impact that the plant will have during my study period, I would expect it to reduce carbon emissions for the system.
Nicole, I'm sorry, I don't know the number of the exhibit, but I'm looking at Mr. Hardy's pre-filed direct testimony of June 30th, 2017, and I would appreciate it if he could have that in front of him.
I think it's exhibit 36. Do you want to have the official one or can we take one?
Yeah.
Page 37. There's a boldface Roman numeral 5 in the middle of the page, and it says responses to testimony filed on behalf of the Conservation Law Foundation. Do you see that?
Yes,
Jerry, what page are you on? I'm sorry.
37.
I'm sorry, Alan, we're looking at page 37, and I was reading from lines 7 and 8.
Thank you.
And on line 10, you're asked, have you reviewed the testimony of CLF witness Professor Roberts? And you say yes. And then starting on line 13, you're asked about disagreements with Professor Roberts. And on line 15, you say, my two greatest concerns with Professor Roberts' pre-filed direct testimony is that he, one, fails to analyze CREC's emission impact on a regional basis, and two, that he incorrectly believes the Resilient Rhode Island Act should be implemented on a generation-based accounting methodology. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
And generation-based accounting methodology was referred to in Dr. Roberts' testimony as production-based accounting, am I right?
I believe that's correct, yes.
And what you're saying here is that there's a difference in looking at the emissions that are properly attributed to the electricity sector if you do a production-based system of accounting, as Dr. Roberts did, or a consumption-based system of accounting, as both you and Dr. Kuhl did. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. And you know, the reason being is, and I think Professor Roberts would agree, carbon emissions is a global issue. So it's important when you're looking at emissions, whether it's total emissions or the impact of different generators, to look at it on a system-wide basis to understand the impact. You can come to alternate conclusions if you're looking at, you know, just on a generation basis. So consumption basis looks at it on a system-wide basis to determine the impacts.
I'm very glad that you talked about system-wide basis and a global problem, because I do have a set of questions dealing with that, and we'll come to that in a moment. First, I'd like you to clarify, I appreciate your discussion about why one may be preferable to the other, but could you start by clarifying for the board, just as a descriptive matter, what is a consumption-based method of accounting for electricity, carbon emissions from the electricity sector, and what is a production-based method of accounting? I'll ask you in a moment about comparing and contrasting them, but for now, tell the board what the difference is.
Okay. So on a consumption basis, it really looks at, you know, from electricity perspective, when we are using electricity, what are the emissions associated with that electricity use? So, as a simple example, take the state of Rhode Island. Some of the electricity supply that serves the electricity demand comes from outside the state. So if you were to look just at the state of Rhode Island, you're not capturing the fact that there are imports coming from outside the state. And those imports have emissions. And it's hard to determine which plant it's actually coming from because the electricity system is inherently complicated. So a consumption base looks at, given the demand on the system, let's look at where all of the emissions are associated with serving that demand. That's consumption based. Production or generation based looks at a particular footprint and just says, this particular set of power plants or this particular supply, what are the emissions associated with that? So it basically just draws a circle around a particular area of power plants and looks at the emissions associated with those plants. Typically, when looking at carbon emissions, because carbon is not a local pollutant, carbon is a global pollutant. So a ton of carbon emitted in Rhode Island versus Maine versus China has equal impact on the environment regardless of where that carbon is released into the environment. That's why you see a lot of carbon programs or carbon regulations really look at it as wide a footprint as possible.
Thank you. Mr. Hardy, I'm not trying to trip you up, but I just want to be sure that we're talking about the same thing. You said that production-based accounting looks at a specific footprint and looks at the carbon emitted from electricity production within that footprint. Is that correct?
Yeah, and maybe footprint was maybe the wrong word, but the point is it looks at it just on the production basis, irrespective of where the demand is being served.
And it looks at production within a defined geographical area, like Rhode Island.
Sure.
And consumption-based accounting recognizes that we have a 6-state New England electricity grid, and that the electricity that we're using here in this building could come from anywhere. And so you look at the average emissions for the area, and then you discount for the amount that we are consuming within the geographical area. Is that fair?
I would say you look at the total emissions associated with the electricity that's needed to serve the demand or the consumption of that area.
Right. So in this case, Rhode Island is 6.11% of the load in the ISO New England footprint. Would you accept that subject to check?
Subject to check, sure. That sounds in the ballpark.
And so to look at carbon emissions by the consumption-based method, you would look at overall emissions for all of New England, multiply that by 6.11% to get the value for the emissions to be properly attributed to Rhode Island. Is that right?
I'm not sure that I would do it that way in terms of it being properly attributed to Rhode Island. I have to think that one through, but I guess if we're saying on a system-wide basis, if we have total emissions for the region, potentially I would have to think that one through. I'm not sure about that.